Today we're going to begin our discussion of the contract theory of ethics, or contractarianism. And as the name suggests, the origin of ethics is thought to be a social contract. Ethics do not exist in nature. They do not exist in our reason or our genetic code or any other independent objective domain. For the contract theory, we get together and agree upon a set of moral rules. So we need to learn what these rules might be and what the justification for artificially creating such a list of rules might be. Okay? Now, before we begin discussion of contract ethics, I'd like to draw a distinction for you. And it is the distinction between psychological egoism and ethical egoism. Can anybody recall from the textbook what either of these means? Well, psychological egoism is not an ethical theory like virtue ethics or natural law ethics, but rather it is a psychological theory about human behavior. Psychological egoism is an explanation of the basic motivation of all human behavior. And the history of theoretical psychology is laden with such theories about what basically drives human behavior. For example, if you read Freud, what does Freud say our basic motivation for doing anything is? Sex, or more generally speaking, the id, right? For Freud, the human psyche can be understood in terms of the ego, the superego, and the id. And the id is the pleasure principle. Everything we do is ultimately motivated by our will to pleasure. If you read Viktor Frankl in his Man's Search for Meaning, he will argue that the basic motivation for human behavior is the will to meaning, that we are willing to put up with almost any conditions so long as there is a meaning for which we suffer. And that is how he explained the survival of people in the death camps of World War II. They had something to live for, whether it's a child or a life's work, a spouse, some cause, something to keep them going. Well, psychological egoism is the view, the observation, that all human behavior is motivated, in fact, by self-interest. We don't do anything that ultimately fails to serve our self-interest. So, for example, if I were to say, I know a man who regularly gives to charity, and you might say that sounds like a very honorable person. And I may say to you, you would think so. However, knowing him personally, I can tell you that he hates giving to charity, and the only reason he does so is so that he can get a tax write-off. So his ultimate motivation in doing so is not to give alms to those in need, but rather it is a selfish motivation. He is getting something out of it, despite the fact that it appears to be benevolent or altruistic. Okay? You should be familiar with those terms. Altruism or benevolence. Altruism simply means I do something for you. Selflessly, self-sacrificially. Benevolence suggests genuine kindness directed at the well-being of others. But the psychological egoist simply observes or concludes that no matter what a person does, ultimately, the reason is self-interest. So the psychological egoist strategy is always to replace a seemingly altruistic motivation in behavior for a self-interested one. And I can share with you a short vignette which illustrates this very point. There's a story about Abraham Lincoln, who was sharing a carriage ride with a companion. And as they were riding, they were discussing this very issue, whether or not people could ever actually behave selflessly, to sacrifice their own well-being for that of another. And Abraham Lincoln took the side of the psychological egoist. He argued that no matter what a person does, ultimately it is because it serves themselves. His companion, on the other hand, was given to a more flattering view of human nature, arguing, as he did, that people are capable of genuinely self-sacrificial action. People can really do things for others without needing to get anything out of it. As they were having their discussion, Lincoln noticed that there was a sow, a mother cow, screaming because her piglets had fallen into a mud trough on the side of the road, and they were drowning. So Lincoln asked the carriage driver to pull over for a moment, and in his best Sunday suit and top hat, jumped out of the carriage and pulled the piglets out of the mud. He got back in, and they proceeded on their way, at which point his companion asked, "Well, Abe, tell me, where did selfishness play a role in this little event?" And Lincoln said, "You fail to miss the point. Had I not saved those little piglets, I wouldn't have had a moment's peace all day. It would have bothered me all day long. So I did it for me. I didn't do it for them." Okay? So there is an example of the reinterpretation of motive on behalf of the psychological egoist. So keep in mind that psychological egoism is not an ethical theory. It is a psychological theory. It is simply an observation or a hypothesis about what drives people to do things. Okay? Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is a theory about what people ought to do. Okay? Remember, psychological theories of behavior tell us what is the case, while ethical theories tell us what ought to be the case, although quite often is not. Okay? You with me? Well, what ethical egoism does is to raise psychological egoism to the level of a moral imperative. The ethical egoist maintains that people ought to seek the satisfaction of self-interest exclusively, to the exclusion of any other concern. That, in fact, if I were to sacrifice my self-interest, my own well-being, for somebody else, I have committed a moral error. And perhaps part of the thinking behind this theory is that the very best thing I can do, even for others, is to cultivate myself. And if you think about it like this, think about the person or people who developed cell phones. Okay? Certainly you imagine that these were lab rats, or people constantly working, constantly designing. Maybe their spouses would be angry with them because they spent so much time coding and writing programs and so forth, okay? And so, in fact, one might be inclined to say, you're so selfish. You never have time for anyone else. You're always concerned with your own projects. But as a result, look what we have. We all have cell phones that can do remarkable things. And so because of that person's selfishness, we have benefited. And so the ethical egoist would probably argue along those lines. Okay? That if I seek to improve myself, which is what I ought to do, it will naturally improve you as well. After all, this would be the basis for competition, right? If I cultivate my own skill and you are my competitor, that is going to force you to push harder as well, which will make you better. Okay? So again, let's begin from this perspective of ethical egoism, which states that one ought always to pursue self-interest to the exclusion of any other interest. Okay? Now I want you to imagine what Hobbes calls the state of nature. Imagine human beings before civil society, before we had laws and law enforcement, before we had corporations and commodious building where we cooperate to build things, to provide food, before the division of labor, okay? Such that in the state of nature, everyone is out for him or herself. According to Hobbes, this is a state of perpetual warfare of every person against every person. There would be no art, no letters, no commodious building, no means of moving or removing such things as require great force, like the building of the Egyptian pyramids, okay? Because we could never get along long enough to complete such projects. Because we know that in the end, everyone is out for self. Think about any movie in which there is some kind of great caper, a heist, right? Something like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where you have a band of thieves, but after the caper is complete, one of the thieves always tries, right, to kill the others or to make off with the loot by himself. Right, exactly. Okay? And according to ethical egoism, this is precisely what you ought to do. If you can get away with serving yourself, you should do so, and the failure to do so would be a moral transgression. Okay? But I want you to imagine the state of nature. No matter how good you are, let's say you've got a talent for building things. You can build your own house. You can sow and reap your own harvest. You can defend yourself. Okay? Nevertheless, you will constantly be looking over your shoulder, paranoid, because you know that there are others watching and just waiting for a weakness, waiting to kill you or to steal from you. Okay? So no matter how adept one become in the state of nature, I would imagine it would be a very solitary life. And as Hobbes famously puts it, in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Life is short because you can only keep up the self-defense and quality of life for so long. Everyone grows old. Everyone grows weak. And even the strongest member of society has to sleep. And in your sleep, you are vulnerable even to the weakest member of society. Okay? So this is a state of warfare. It is brutal.
This would happen if what?
This is what Mill imagines the state of nature would be like. No laws, right? Now, in the state of nature, if you look at other animals, they do not follow laws. What is the rule that governs the jungle? And? Yeah, survival of the fittest. Okay? Right. Nature selects successful traits. And if you do not adapt to your environment, you don't pass on your genes. And so, of course, this is a good thing at the level of the species, because the species evolves. And after all, that's where we eventually came from. Okay? In the state of nature, there are no moral restrictions. In fact, everyone has a right to absolutely everything. Why? Because it is not written anywhere that there are restrictions on what one is entitled to. In fact, to give emphasis to this radical entitlement, Hobbes says that everyone has an absolute right to absolutely everything, including the bodies of others. I have a natural right to do and to use anything which I deem most apt to securing my life and well-being, even if it means commandeering your body, just as you have. Okay? Now I want you to imagine, what would life be like in such a condition?
Rape, murder.
Of course, all that stuff. You imagine what, the convention center and the Superdome were like after Katrina. Okay? Yeah, the state of nature. We act like animals. Smart ones.
Trafficking.
All kinds of things. All kinds of things we would consider to be morally atrocious. But if you said that to the ethical egoist, they would say, why atrocious? Show me where it says that people ought to respect the fruit of another person's labor. On whose authority do you make the claim that I do not have a right to lie to you or to steal from you? In fact, the concept of stealing doesn't even make sense, because there is no basis for personal property. Okay? So we soon figure out, because we are rational after all, that unless we agree not to take advantage of all our rights, but rather sacrifice some of our natural rights, lay them down, we gather in the forest and we say, look, we understand that everyone has a right to do whatever they please. However, it isn't working out because nobody can feel secure that they will be able to benefit from the fruit of their labor or are safe from the onslaught of others. So we draw up a contract, a covenant, in which we agree to lay down some of our natural rights. We suspend them. For example, I agree not to take the fruit which you have harvested, so long as you agree not to take the fruit that I have harvested. I agree not to harm you, so long as you agree not to harm me. I agree to tell the truth, so long as you agree also to tell the truth. Okay? And by thereby sacrificing some of our natural rights, we live in what might be called a more civilized society. We may not get everything which we desire, but we will certainly be better off than we would have been in the state of nature, where self-interest runs rampant without any restraint whatsoever. So it's very important for you to remember that the contract does not bestow rights. It takes them away. But we are willing to sacrifice our rights because as rational beings, we recognize that we will achieve a greater share in our self-interest under the terms of the contract than we would have in the state of nature. Everybody with me?
There's not the steroids.
It takes them away, right?
Say it again.
I'm asking you to, I guess, finish. It does not bestow rights. Rather.
It takes them away or suspends them. Okay? I still have the right to do anything I deem most apt to the satisfaction of my life and the quality thereof. But I have agreed that I will not avail myself of those rights so long as all of you have agreed likewise. But notice, the ultimate moral principle is not to obey the contract. The ultimate moral principle is to pursue your self-interest. It just happens to be that the most promising way of securing my self-interest is to suspend some of my natural rights. But let's say that I come up with a scheme whereby I am convinced that I can get away with breaking the terms of the contract without getting caught. What should I do? If I believe that I can rob a bank and get away with it,
The ethical egoist would say,
do it.
do it.
That's right. If you believe that you can breach the terms of the contract without any ill consequence, then you have a moral obligation to do so.
That's ethical ego.
Right.
Ethical egoism. So tell me, the contract makes sense. It is rational, so long as one is benefiting from it. So long as the contract is actually serving my self-interest, it makes sense for me to obey it. But once the contract no longer benefits me, let's say that I am following the rules, but I notice that other people are getting away with violating them, then I have a moral obligation to violate them as well. If I am no longer benefiting from the contract, then I am exempt. Okay? So now you tell me, in order for this contract to work, not only must it be rational, meaning that it actually benefits us, what else? It must be enforceable. We must set up some kind of system whereby the breach of one of our agreed upon rules would bring such horrendous suffering that it would outweigh any good which I had hoped to achieve by breaking the rules. Okay? A covenant needs a sword. Okay? And so, in addition to laying down my right to absolutely everything, I also transfer the right of seeking retribution for wrongs committed against me to a single sovereign power, a police force. So if somebody takes something from me, I tell the sovereign, and the sovereign metes out the appropriate punishment. Now you must imagine that this sovereign power, the Leviathan, from which Mill's work takes its title, the Leviathan. What is the Leviathan, by the way? It's a mythical sea creature, which was so fearsome, right, that no one would dare challenge it. Well, let's bring this up to date a little bit. Imagine that if you break the rules of the contract, the Terminator is coming for you. And the Terminator will not stop and cannot be stopped until you are dead. So nothing I could possibly stand to gain by breaching the contract could possibly justify the risk I put myself at by doing so. Okay? All right. So remember that in the state of nature, unlike some of the other moral traditions which read human nature as having a benevolent side, okay, or assume the existence of an eternal order of things instituted by God, the contract theory assumes none of that. In the state of nature, there are no natural purposes from which we could deduce moral obligations. There is no God. There is no altruism. And as you can imagine, any leaning I might have toward helping other people will quickly be snuffed out as soon as I help you and then you stab me in the back. I will be very reluctant to help anyone again. Okay? So everyone is out for self. But as long as we have agreed to the terms of the contract and are sufficiently fearful of the consequences of breaking it, then everyone will be better off than they would have been in the state of nature. Okay? So we get together and we agree, I'm not going to take the things that you have labored for. I'm not going to harm you. I'm not going to lie to you. Okay? And you can imagine any rules which ordinarily would govern a civilized society. Okay? So the principle of the social contract is simply people ought to participate in social contracts. But why? Not because there is anything intrinsically valuable about altruistic behavior. Not because it is good in and of itself not to steal, not to lie, not to harm the innocent, etc. But only because not doing so is the surest way for me to get the greatest share of satisfaction of my self-interest. But let's imagine again that I have what I deem to be a foolproof plan for violating the rules and avoiding the repercussions of the sovereign power. Then indeed I ought to do so, because the ultimate moral principle is self-interest. Okay? The contract is in fact an artificial means of getting what we really want, whatever is in our interest. Okay? So this is a very interesting and indirect way of establishing a moral code. We are not pretending that we are benevolent beings or have goodwill toward others. The only motivation we have is the satisfaction of our own desire. But because we are reasonable beings, we recognize that while I may not get everything I ever dreamt of having, I will certainly be better off under the terms of the contract than I would have been in the state of nature where even the strongest is vulnerable. Okay? Now it might be that over time, I'm talking about over generations of people following the contract, perhaps this could change our nature. Maybe we become more benevolent. Okay? But that is not necessarily the case. Moral rules are artificial, and they exist solely for the purpose of satisfying the ultimate moral principle, which is ethical egoism. Okay? But there will always be backsliders, people who break the rules, free riders, people who benefit from the rules without following them. Well, they are for the sovereign power to deal with. Okay? However, again, if I notice that I have been following all the rules, I'm not stealing, I'm not lying, I'm not harming others, and yet I see that people are giving bribes to the sovereign, who's looking the other way as they rob banks. If I am following the terms of the contract, but I'm no longer benefiting from it, then I am exempt from the contract. Okay? So what the contract actually does is to transform what we might call ethical egoism, which is simply the view that people ought to pursue self-interest to the exclusion of any other interest, to what we might call a kind of rule egoism. The contract does that. It is still egoism. We are still driven fundamentally by our desire to satisfy self. But we realize that the most promising strategy for doing so is by obeying the terms of the contract. So, ethical egoism, with the addition of the contract, becomes rule egoism. It is egoism governed by a restricting set of rules. Always remember that the contract is not like an ordinary contract where we are bestowed rights. This contract asks us to sacrifice rights. I still have the right to absolutely everything, but I have agreed to lay those rights down because I will be better off than I would have been otherwise. Okay? However, there is one thing which I cannot, under any circumstances, sacrifice, and that is the right to protect my own life. Because that ultimately is the basis for all behavior and for the contract itself. An effective contract must be both reasonable, namely, meaning I will benefit from it, and it must be enforceable. Okay? Now, do you remember when I said that each of the ethical traditions that we will consider has some aspect of the golden rule built into it? Okay? We saw that virtue ethics, even though the motivation, the justification for seeking virtue is one's own well-being and flourishing, still, by becoming virtuous, I will naturally treat others with justice and temperance and piety and courage. Okay? In natural law theory, although I am acting according to the goods indicated by my four fundamental inclinations: life, sociability, knowledge, and procreation. Of course, by seeking knowledge and social bonds and life and children, I am naturally treating others the way I would like to be treated. Well, consider contract theory. Ultimately, I really don't care about anybody else. Okay? My primary interest is self. However, there is no doubt that if I treat you well, if you know me as someone who always follows the rules of the contract, okay? And you get it in your head that maybe you could get away with breaching the contract, you'll probably be less likely to breach it to my disadvantage. If I treat you well, you are more likely to treat me well. Okay? So even though the golden rule is not primary here, I'm not treating you well because I wish you to treat me well. I'm treating you well, where well means according to the contract, only because I fear the repercussion of not doing so. Still, I treat you according to the contract, and thus am more likely to be treated in like kind. Okay? So let's take a look at the four aspects of ethics according to Mazzoni, given contract theory. First of all, what is the origin of ethics? The social contract. But I suppose we could push this a little further and say ultimately the origin is self-interest. The contract is artificial. It is the surest way of securing what we ultimately want, our self-interest. But yeah, on a quiz, I would accept the social contract or self-interest as the origin of ethics. Okay? What about relativism? Yeah. Contract theory certainly can accommodate cultural relativism because the particular set of rules upon which we agree may be the result of our particular environment, right? I can explain why one culture has agreed, I don't know, not to make a wake in the bay as I'm driving my boat past your property, okay? Because that could destroy your property. Whereas no such rule exists in a society that lives on the land, okay? So the rules may be different, but the overriding principle is the same. It is self-interest governed by a contract. Okay? What about human nature? Yeah, we are completely egoistic, self-interested. Now, somebody looking at our society from the outside may say, wow, what an enlightened, moral, sophisticated society. But of course, we know that this is just artifice. We are behaving this way because we want what we want and are less likely to get it if we don't obey the contract. So human nature is self-interested. And you may say this is not a particularly flattering view of human nature. Maybe, maybe not. But it certainly smacks of truth. You know, if you think of the clearest case of altruistic behavior or benevolent leanings, you might think of like a mother with her child, right? A mother, in the real sense of the word, I don't just mean a biological mother, I mean a mother who cares for her children. You might say, does so selflessly, okay? But the psychological egoist would come along and say, actually, the reason the mother does the things she does, providing for her children, caring for them, is to avoid the guilt she would feel if she didn't. Okay? Of course, we may then retort by saying, well, wait a minute. Why would the mother feel guilty if she didn't care for her children? And the answer might be because she knows it's the right thing to do. Okay? So I'm not arguing that the psychological egoist is necessarily correct. There might be an altruistic element to our nature. We may have a natural feeling of benevolence toward our fellows, but the contract theory rejects that idea. We are strictly self-interested beings, and the contract is not the ideal scenario, but it is the best answer to self-interest run rampant in the state of nature. And according to contract ethics, an action is right, practically speaking, if it serves your self-interest. And obeying the contract will serve your self-interest, provided that everyone else is obeying the contract as well. Okay? Again, this is largely the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Mill's book is called Utilitarianism. Okay? Also the Leviathan. And that's what we get. Okay, interesting. You know, one of our concerns is always the origin of ethics. What is the basis? Where do our ethical ideas come from? And it may seem to us that, well, I don't know, I just seem to have been born with a moral conscience, a kind of common sense moral intuition about how I ought to treat people. But perhaps we aren't being completely honest with ourselves. Perhaps if we had an invisibility cloak, we'd be taking advantage of all sorts of situations which we ordinarily wouldn't, but only because we fear the repercussion of being caught. Okay? Remember, there is nothing intrinsically valuable about benevolent behavior. There's nothing intrinsically good about telling the truth or respecting the fruit of another's labor, or even resisting the temptation to harm another person. The sole reason we desist from these behaviors is because the consequence of doing so would outweigh the benefit of doing so. What do you think?
Interesting stuff. Like, I guess you said since happiness is an intrinsic good. There is, you're right, I guess, when you say that it's not an intrinsic good to whatever, not steal, or we just don't do it because we know.
I think you're right. When the ethical egoist, and of course, contract theorists are ethical egoists, okay? They just realize that the desideratum of our self-interest, that which we desire, is more attainable under the terms of the contract than in the state of nature. And so I don't think it would be unfair to say that the ethical egoist sees happiness as an intrinsic good, but happiness, of course, is simply going to mean the satisfaction of your wants.
Right.
And what you want may be different than what I want. But where we are the same, what is universal, according to this theory, is that all people are self-interested. And anything we do, no matter how selfless, altruistic, giving, kind it may seem, there is always a self-interested motive lurking in the background. Okay? What the contract theory does is to artificially interject restrictions on our natural rights such that we can have a greater share in what we really want, which is the satisfaction of desire. It's a very interesting theory, because the rest of the theories really find some origin of ethics outside of our desires. Okay? Typically, the history of ethics will rank reason above appetite. And if I simply act according to my appetites or desires, then I end up suffering. And so reason tells me I ought to be temperate, I ought to be just, etc. Okay? This theory straightforwardly says that whatever we desire ought to be pursued. Okay? The problem is it just doesn't work when everyone's doing the same thing. There is one apple, and you and I both want it. And in the state of nature, that makes us enemies. Okay? Enter the contract. We split it, or we compensate the other. We work it out, because it's better to have half an apple than no apple. Okay? Pretty straightforward, and that's why I only allot one day's discussion for the contract theory. Of course, like any of the traditions, you could spend a lifetime developing it, and if you read utilitarianism, I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that earlier. It's the Leviathan. Utilitarianism is John Stewart. What the hell did I do? Bentham Mill. I've got this completely backwards. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know why I keep thinking utilitarianism. Everyone at home, this is not Bentham and Mill. This is Hobbes. I knew something was awry. Bentham and Mill are utilitarians, and that is our next chapter, okay? Contract ethics is the work largely of Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan, okay? So disregard all that utilitarian stuff. Bentham and Mill are still on deck for us, okay? Mental glitch. Sorry. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, that's it. Remember that your quiz over natural law theory is due by 11:59 this evening. And I will post a quiz over contract ethics sometime today or tomorrow. Okay? don't forget to do your reading for utilitarianism, which we will break into a couple of days.